The summer sun blazed down on the cobblestones outside Buckingham Palace as thousands of tourists gathered for the famous changing of the guard ceremony. Among the crowd stood Marcus Thompson, a 28-year-old influencer from California, accompanied by his girlfriend Sarah and two college friends. They had come to London specifically to create viral content for Marcus's social media channels, which boasted over 500,000 followers. Marcus spotted the perfect opportunity when he noticed a lone Kingsguard standing at attention near the palace gates. The soldier, Guardsman James Mitchell, stood motionless in his iconic red tunic and towering bearskin hat, his rifle held at his side. The 24-year-old had been serving in the Coldstream Guards for 3 years and took immense pride in his duty to protect the royal family. "This is it. Guys," Marcus whispered to his friends, pulling out his phone. "Watch me get this guy to break character. My followers are going to lose their minds." Sarah felt uneasy about the plan. "Marcus, maybe we shouldn't bother him. He's just doing his job." But Marcus was already approaching the guard, his camera rolling. He started by making silly faces just inches from Guardsman Mitchell's stoic expression. When that failed to get a reaction, he began making loud noises and waving his arms dramatically. The other tourists around them started to notice, some pulling out their own phones to record the spectacle. Guardsman Mitchell remained perfectly still, his eyes focused straight ahead. Years of training had prepared him for exactly this type of situation. Tourists often tried to get reactions from the guards, but this felt different. This young man seemed determined to push boundaries that others respected. Marcus grew more frustrated with each passing minute. His content wasn't exciting enough yet. He needed something bigger, something that would guarantee viral status. That's when he made his first serious mistake. He reached out and touched the guard's rifle, trying to pose for a selfie while gripping the weapon. The moment Marcus's hand made contact with the rifle, Guardsman Mitchell's training kicked in. In one swift, practiced movement, he brought his rifle across his body and delivered a sharp verbal warning that echoed across the courtyard. "Stand back from the Queen's Guard!" The crowd gasped and stepped backward, but Marcus, instead of heeding the warning, laughed and turned to his camera. "Did you guys see that? I actually got him to move. This is going to break the internet." What Marcus didn't realize was that his actions had already crossed a serious line. Touching a guard's weapon wasn't just disrespectful, it was considered a potential security threat. Several police officers who had been monitoring the area began moving closer to the scene, their hands resting on their radios. Guardsman Mitchell returned to his position, but his senses were now on high alert. He had dealt with countless tourists over his years of service, but something about this group felt different. The young man with the camera seemed unwilling to accept the boundary that had been clearly established. Sarah tugged at Marcus's sleeve. "Come on, let's go. You got your video. People are staring." But Marcus was intoxicated by the attention and the potential for viral fame. The crowd had grown larger, and he could see other people filming him now. In his mind, this was turning into the perfect storm for internet celebrity. He decided to push even further. "Watch this," he told his friends, ignoring Sarah's pleas to leave. "I'm going to see how far I can push this guy before he completely loses it." The tourists around them began to murmur among themselves. Some were clearly uncomfortable with what they were witnessing, while others seemed entertained by the unfolding drama. A group of British tourists near the back of the crowd shook their heads in disapproval, muttering about disrespectful Americans and lack of proper respect. Marcus positioned himself directly in front of Guardsman Mitchell once again, this time standing even closer than before. He began making exaggerated military movements, mockingly mimicking the guard's posture and stance. The crowd's reaction was mixed. Some gasped at his audacity while others laughed nervously. What none of the tourists realized was that Guardsman Mitchell was not alone. Hidden from view, other members of the King's Guard were monitoring the situation through sophisticated communication systems. The moment Marcus had touched the rifle, alerts had been sent through the proper channels. The wheels were already in motion for what would become a response that Marcus never saw coming. The stage was set for a confrontation that would teach Marcus and his friends a lesson about respect, tradition, and the serious nature of the duties performed by the King's Guard. The carefree atmosphere of a typical tourist day was about to transform into something much more serious. and Marcus's quest for viral fame was about to take a turn that would leave him questioning everything he thought he knew about boundaries and consequences. Marcus's mockery grew bolder by the minute. He began shouting commands at Guardsman Mitchell, treating the solemn ceremony like his personal entertainment show. "Hey, soldier boy, why don't you march for us? Come on, do something interesting." The crowd around them had swelled to nearly 100 people, all watching the escalating situation with a mixture of fascination and horror. Many British tourists looked genuinely offended, while others seemed embarrassed by the Americans' behavior. Several elderly visitors shook their heads in disgust, remembering when such displays of disrespect would never have been tolerated. Sarah grabbed Marcus's arm more forcefully this time. "Marcus, seriously, stop this right now. You're making a scene and not in a good way." "That's exactly the point," Marcus replied, shaking her off. "Controversy gets views. Drama gets shares. This is going to make me famous." His friend Jake, who had been recording everything on his own phone, started to feel uncomfortable. "Dude, maybe Sarah's right. The guy's just doing his job. This feels kind of mean now." But Marcus was too caught up in the moment to listen to reason. He had noticed that several people in the crowd were now filming him instead of the guard, and his ego couldn't resist the attention. In his mind, he was already imagining the millions of views, the news coverage, and the sponsorship deals that would follow. That's when he made his second critical mistake. Marcus decided to physically block Guardsman Mitchell's path. When the ceremony began and the guard needed to move to his next position, Marcus stepped directly in front of him, spreading his arms wide and grinning at his camera. "Not so fast, buddy. You've got to get past me first." Guardsman Mitchell found himself in an impossible situation. His duty required him to maintain his post and follow the precise choreography of the ceremony, but this tourist was now actively preventing him from performing his duties. The young soldier's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, the only sign of his growing frustration. The other guards in the ceremony had no choice but to halt their movements. The entire changing of the guard, a tradition dating back centuries and watched by thousands of tourists daily, ground to a complete stop because of one man's selfish desire for internet fame. A hush fell over the crowd as people realized the gravity of what was happening. This wasn't just about bothering a single guard anymore. Marcus had disrupted an official royal ceremony. The weight of tradition and protocol that surrounded the British monarchy made his actions feel even more shocking. Police, officers who had been maintaining a respectful distance, now began moving through the crowd with purpose. They had been monitoring the situation from the beginning, but disrupting an official ceremony crossed a line that required immediate action. Detective Inspector Helen Crawford, a 15-year veteran of the Metropolitan Police, received the radio call about the situation. She had seen countless tourist incidents over the years, but something about this report made her accelerate her pace toward the palace gates. Interfering with the king's guard during an official ceremony wasn't just disrespectful, it was potentially illegal. Meanwhile, Marcus continued to play to his audience, completely oblivious to the serious consequences heading his way. He began making exaggerated announcements to the crowd, as if he were the master of ceremonies. "Ladies and gentlemen, witness history in the making. I'm probably the first person ever to stop the entire King's Guard ceremony." What Marcus didn't know was that his boast was not only wrong but incredibly foolish. The few times in history when the ceremony had been disrupted were due to serious security threats or emergencies, not tourist antics. His actions were being viewed through a very different lens by the authorities monitoring the situation. Guardsman Mitchell, despite his professional training and composure, was reaching his limit. He had sworn an oath to protect the crown and uphold the dignity of his regiment. Every second that this tourist continued his disruption was a stain on that sacred duty. But he also knew that any reaction from him needed to be measured and appropriate. The tension in the air was palpable. Tourists who had come to witness a beautiful traditional ceremony were instead watching a young man's ego run completely out of control. Some began to leave, uncomfortable with being associated with the scene, while others stayed, morbidly curious about how far the situation would escalate. Sarah made one final desperate attempt to reason with her boyfriend. "Marcus, please, look around you. Everyone thinks you're being an idiot. This isn't funny anymore. Let's just leave before something bad happens." But Marcus was beyond reason now. The rush of attention, the thrill of disruption, and his complete misunderstanding of the situation had created a perfect storm of poor judgment. He looked at the guard, then at his camera, and made a decision that would change everything. You know what? I don't think this guy is tough enough to stop me. Let's see what happens if I really push his buttons. The crowd collectively held its breath as Marcus prepared to cross a line that would transform his silly tourist prank into something far more serious. The approaching police officers quickened their pace, sensing that the situation was about to escalate beyond simple disruption into something that would require immediate and decisive action. Marcus raised his hand and actually poked Guardsman Mitchell in the chest with his finger, still filming with his other hand. Come on, robot man. Do something. Your audience is getting bored. The moment Marcus made physical contact with the guard, everything changed. Guardsman Mitchell's years of military training took over completely. In one fluid motion that happened so fast most spectators missed it, he grabbed Marcus's wrist, spun him around, and pressed him firmly against the palace wall. You are under citizen's arrest for assault on a member of Her Majesty's forces and disruption of official duties. Guardsman Mitchell's voice boomed across the courtyard with an authority that made everyone within 50 feet freeze in place. Marcus's phone clattered to the ground as his face was pressed against the cold stone wall of Buckingham Palace. The reality of his situation hit him like a sledgehammer. This wasn't going according to plan at all. The guard wasn't supposed to be able to do this. This was supposed to be funny content for his social media, not a real arrest. Wait. Marcus gasped, struggling against the guard's iron grip. This is just a prank. I'm making a video. You can't arrest me for making a video. But Guardsman Mitchell held firm, his training taking precedence over any explanations. He had been touched aggressively by a tourist who had already disrupted an official ceremony. Protocol was clear, and his response was both legal and necessary. The crowd erupted into chaos. Sarah screamed and rushed forward, only to be immediately stopped by two police officers who had finally reached the scene. Jake and their other friend stood frozen, their phones still recording but their faces showing pure shock at how quickly their friend's prank had turned into a genuine arrest situation. Detective Inspector Crawford arrived just as Guardsman Mitchell was securing Marcus against the wall. She quickly assessed the situation, noting the disrupted ceremony, the crowd of agitated tourists, and the clear evidence of physical contact between the tourist and the guard. Sir, I'm Detective Inspector Crawford with the Metropolitan Police, she announced to Marcus, who was still struggling to understand what was happening. You're being detained for assault on a member of the King's Guard, disruption of official royal ceremonies, and disturbing the peace. Do you understand these charges? Marcus's head was spinning. Assault? I barely touched him. This is insane. I'm an American citizen. You can't do this to me. Inspector Crawford had heard similar protests countless times over the years. Tourist nationality meant nothing when laws were broken on British soil, especially laws involving the protection of royal ceremonies and personnel. Sir, your nationality is irrelevant. You are subject to British law while on British soil, and you have violated several of those laws. The other guards, who had been frozen in position during the initial disruption, now moved with practiced precision to restore order to the ceremony. Additional security personnel appeared as if from nowhere, efficiently managing the crowd and ensuring the situation remained contained. Sarah was crying now, begging the officers to let Marcus go. He's not a bad person. He just makes videos for the internet. He didn't mean any harm. But her pleas fell on deaf ears. The officers had witnessed the entire sequence of events, from the initial disrespectful behavior to the physical contact that constituted assault under British law. Marcus's intentions were irrelevant now. His actions had crossed legal boundaries. As Marcus was handcuffed by the police officers, the full weight of his situation began to sink in. This wasn't just going to be an embarrassing story to tell his friends back home. He was actually being arrested in a foreign country for assaulting a guard at Buckingham Palace. The viral fame he had sought was about to become a nightmare of international proportions. My phone, Marcus called out desperately. I need my phone. All my content is on there. Inspector Crawford picked up the dropped device and examined it briefly. This phone is now evidence in your case, sir. You'll be given instructions on how to retrieve your personal belongings after you've been processed. The crowd watched in stunned silence as Marcus was led away from the palace. Many tourists who had been filming the initial confrontation now found themselves holding evidence of what could become a significant international incident. The story was already beginning to spread through social media as people shared videos of the arrest. Guardsman Mitchell straightened his uniform and returned to his position as if nothing had happened. His face remained impassive, but inside he felt a mixture of satisfaction and concern. Satisfaction that the disruption had been handled properly, but concern about the potential media attention that would inevitably follow. What none of them realized yet was that this incident was about to become much bigger than anyone imagined. Marcus's arrest at Buckingham Palace was going to make international news, but not in the way he had hoped. Instead of becoming famous as a successful influencer, he was about to become notorious as the American tourist who assaulted a king's guard and faced serious criminal charges in Britain. The ceremony resumed its dignified pace, but the atmosphere had been forever changed. This day would be remembered not for the beautiful tradition of the changing of the guard, but for one young man's catastrophic failure to understand the difference between entertainment and respect, between viral content and criminal behavior. Marcus found himself in the back of a police van, his wrists still cuffed behind his back, staring at the floor in complete disbelief. The reality of his situation was finally beginning to penetrate through his shock. He wasn't just in trouble, he was in serious legal trouble in a foreign country, and he had absolutely no idea what that meant for his future. Detective Inspector Crawford sat across from him, reviewing her notes from the incident. She had seen many tourists make poor decisions over her career, but the brazen nature of Marcus's actions stood out even among the worst cases she could remember. "Where exactly are you taking me?" Marcus asked, his voice much quieter now than it had been during his confrontation with the guard. "Belgravia Police Station," Crawford replied matter-of-factly. "You'll be formally charged and processed there. Then we'll determine whether you'll be released on bail or held pending your court appearance." The words court appearance hit Marcus like a physical blow. Court meant lawyers, which meant money he didn't have. Court meant potentially being stuck in London indefinitely, which meant missing his job back home. Court meant this whole nightmare was just beginning, not ending. Meanwhile, back at Buckingham Palace, Sarah was frantically trying to contact the American embassy, while simultaneously fielding calls from Marcus's parents, who had somehow already heard about the incident through social media. The videos of Marcus's arrest were spreading across the internet at lightning speed, accompanied by headlines that made the situation sound even worse than it already was. Jake showed Sarah his phone screen with growing horror. "Look at this, Sarah. It's already on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, everywhere. People are calling him the ugliest American tourist ever, and the guy who attacked the Queen's Guard. This is going viral, but not how he wanted it to." The American embassy had indeed been contacted, but not by Sarah, the British. Authorities had followed proper protocol and notified the embassy that an American citizen had been arrested for assault charges involving the King's Guard embassy. Officials were already preparing for what they knew would become a media circus. At Belgravia Police Station, Marcus was processed with the same methodical efficiency that characterized all British legal proceedings. His fingerprints were taken, his mugshot was photographed, and his personal belongings were catalogued and stored. Each step of the process made his situation feel more real and more serious. "I want to call a lawyer," Marcus said during his processing, finally understanding that this wasn't going to be resolved with apologies and promises to behave better. "You have the right to legal representation," the custody sergeant confirmed. "However, given the nature of your charges and the fact that you're a foreign national, the court may require you to surrender your passport and remain in the UK until your case is resolved." The words made Marcus's stomach drop. He had a life back in California, a job, an apartment, responsibilities. The idea of being trapped in London indefinitely while facing criminal charges was beyond his worst nightmares. Back at the palace, Guardsman Mitchell was being debriefed by his superior officers. The incident had been handled perfectly according to protocol, but everyone understood that the media attention would be intense. The regiment's public relations officer was already fielding calls from news outlets around the world. "Did I handle it correctly, sir?" Mitchell asked his commanding officer, Colonel Davies. "You followed protocol exactly as you were trained to do, Mitchell. The tourist made physical contact with you after disrupting an official ceremony. Your response was measured, appropriate, and legal. Don't second-guess yourself. But even Colonel Davies knew that public opinion wouldn't necessarily align with military protocol. The incident would be analyzed, criticized, and debated by people who had never served in the military and didn't understand the serious nature of the guard's duties. Within hours of the arrest, the story had exploded across international media. News outlets from around the world were reporting on the American tourist who assaulted a king's guard at Buckingham Palace. The headlines grew more sensational with each retelling, and the videos of Marcus's behavior were being played on repeat on news channels globally. Marcus's social media accounts, which had been his pride and joy just hours earlier, were now flooded with angry comments from people around the world. His follower count was indeed growing rapidly, but for all the wrong reasons. People weren't following him to see his content. They were following him to express their outrage at his behavior. His parents, Robert and Linda Thompson, were watching the news coverage from their home in Sacramento with a mixture of shame and worry. Their son's face was being broadcast around the world as an example of American tourist behavior at its worst. The phone hadn't stopped ringing with calls from reporters, distant relatives, and neighbors who had seen the story. How did we raise a son who would do something like this? Linda asked her husband through her tears. Robert was equally devastated. I don't understand it. We taught him to respect authority, to be polite, to represent our country well when he traveled. How did it come to this? The American Embassy in London was working quietly behind the scenes to ensure that Marcus received proper legal representation, but they couldn't intervene in the legal process itself. Embassy officials were also preparing for the inevitable media requests and trying to manage the diplomatic implications of the incident. As night fell over London, Marcus sat in a holding cell, finally beginning to comprehend the magnitude of his mistakes. The viral fame he had sought so desperately was his, but it had come at a cost he never could have imagined. His quest for internet celebrity had transformed him from an unknown influencer into an international symbol of disrespectful tourist behavior, and there seemed to be no way to undo the damage he had caused. The next morning, Marcus appeared before Magistrate Judge Elizabeth Harrington at Westminster Magistrates Court. The courtroom was packed with reporters, tourists, and curious locals who had heard about the case. Judge Harrington, a veteran of 23 years on the bench, had presided over thousands of cases, but rarely ones that attracted this level of international attention. Marcus's court-appointed solicitor, David Chen, had spent the entire night reviewing the case and preparing his client for what would be a very public legal proceeding. Chen had handled many tourist-related incidents, but the video evidence and witness testimonies in this case made it particularly challenging. Mr. Thompson, Judge Harrington began, her voice carrying the weight of judicial authority. You are charged with assault on a member of the King's Guard, disruption of official royal ceremonies, and disturbing the peace. How do you plead to these charges? Marcus looked at his solicitor, who nodded encouragingly. They had discussed this moment extensively. Not guilty, Your Honor. A murmur rippled through the packed courtroom. The plea surprised many observers, given the clear video evidence of the incident that had been broadcast worldwide. Judge Harrington maintained her composure and continued with the proceedings. The prosecution, led by Crown Prosecutor Sarah Williams, presented their case with methodical precision. The video evidence was damning. It clearly showed Marcus touching the guard's rifle, physically blocking his path, disrupting the ceremony, and finally making physical contact with Guardsman Mitchell's chest. Your Honor, Prosecutor Williams addressed the court, the defendant's actions represent a clear breach of British law. He assaulted a member of the King's Guard while that guard was performing official duties in protection of the Crown. This is not a case of misunderstanding or cultural differences. This is a case of deliberate, escalating disrespectful behavior that culminated in physical assault. When it came time for the defense, Solicitor Chen faced an uphill battle. The evidence was clear, but he attempted to frame Marcus's actions as those of an ignorant tourist who didn't understand the seriousness of the situation, rather than someone with malicious intent. Your Honor, my client is a young man who made a series of very poor decisions while visiting your beautiful country. He deeply regrets his actions and never intended to assault anyone or disrupt any ceremony. He simply didn't understand the serious nature of the King's Guard duties and thought he was engaging in Harmless tourist behavior, Judge. Harrington listened to both sides with the patience that came from decades of experience, but her expression remained stern throughout the proceedings. When the evidence presentation concluded, she delivered her verdict with characteristic British directness. Mr. Thompson, your behavior as captured on video evidence is inexcusable. The King's Guard serves a vital function in protecting our royal family and maintaining the dignity of our most sacred traditions. Your actions showed complete disrespect for British law, British culture, and the dedicated service members who protect our crown. Marcus felt his legs go weak as he listened to the judge's words. This was really happening. He was about to be sentenced by a British court for assaulting a King's Guard at Buckingham Palace. However, Judge Harrington continued, I do believe that your actions, while serious, were born more from ignorance and poor judgment than from malicious intent. Therefore, I sentence you to 30 days in prison, suspended on the condition that you perform 200 hours of community service, pay a fine of $2,000, and issue a formal public apology to the King's Guard, regiment, and the British people. The courtroom erupted in discussion as reporters frantically took notes and observers debated whether the sentence was too harsh or too lenient. Marcus felt relief that he wouldn't be going to prison, but the reality of his situation was still overwhelming. Additionally, Judge Harrington added, raising her voice to quiet the courtroom, you are banned from entering any royal property for a period of 5 years, and your passport will be returned only after you have completed your community service and paid your fine in full. Sarah, who had been sitting in the gallery throughout the proceedings, broke down in tears. The man she had fallen in love with had become an international embarrassment, and now he was trapped in London indefinitely while completing his sentence. Outside the courthouse, the media frenzy was intense. Reporters from around the world shouted questions at Marcus as he left the building, flanked by his solicitor and court security. The headlines were already being written. American tourist sentenced for assault on King's Guard, and viral fame turns to legal nightmare for social media influencer. Marcus's parents had flown to London to support their son, but they too were overwhelmed by the media attention. Every step they took was photographed. Every word they spoke was recorded, and their family's private shame had become a public spectacle. The King's Guard Regiment issued a statement through their public relations office, expressing satisfaction with the court's decision, while emphasizing the serious nature of their duties and the importance of public respect for their service. Guardsman Mitchell, who had handled the incident with such professionalism, was commended by his superiors but remained out of the public eye. As Marcus walked through the streets of London that evening, recognizing faces of people who recognized him from the news coverage, he began to understand the true cost of his actions. His quest for viral fame had succeeded beyond his wildest dreams, but the fame was entirely negative, and the consequences were far more serious than he had ever imagined possible. The suspended prison sentence meant he was free to move around London, but he was also trapped there until he completed 200 hours of community service and paid a substantial fine. His American life was on hold indefinitely, and every day of his forced stay in London would serve as a reminder of the moment when his poor judgment changed everything. 6 months later, Marcus stood in the same courtyard where his life had changed forever. But this time he wore the orange vest of a community service worker and carried cleaning supplies instead of a camera phone. His 200 hours of community service had been assigned to maintaining the very tourist areas where his incident had occurred, creating a daily reminder of his mistakes. The irony wasn't lost on him that he was now helping to preserve the dignity and cleanliness of the places he had once tried to exploit for social media content. Every day tourists would recognize him from the viral videos, and he had learned to handle their stares and whispered comments with a humility that was completely foreign to his former self. Sarah had returned to California after the first month, unable to handle the constant media attention and the dramatic change in Marcus's personality. Their relationship had become another casualty of his poor decisions, though she had wished him well and promised to remain friends. The breakup had been painful but necessary for both of them. Marcus's community service supervisor, Mrs. Eleanor Davies, was a stern but fair woman in her 60s who had been managing community service programs for over 20 years. She had seen many young people come through her program, but Marcus's case was unique due to the international attention it had received. Thompson, she called out as Marcus finished cleaning the area around the palace gates. "Come have a word with me." Marcus approached her with the respectful demeanor he had developed over months of learning to take responsibility for his actions. "Yes, Mrs. Davies? You've got about 30 hours left on your service requirement," she said, consulting her clipboard. "I have to say, when you first arrived, I expected you to be difficult, entitled, probably looking for shortcuts. But you've surprised me." Marcus looked down at his hands, which were now calloused from months of physical labor. "I learned pretty quickly that there weren't going to be any shortcuts out of this mess I created." Over the months of his community service, Marcus had encountered several members of the King's Guard during their off-duty hours. Initially, these meetings had been awkward and tense, but gradually they had evolved into something approaching mutual respect. The guards had seen many tourists behave badly, but they had never seen one return to make amends the way Marcus was doing. One evening, as Marcus was finishing his daily service work, Guardsman Mitchell appeared in civilian clothes. It was the first time they had spoken since the incident, and Marcus felt his heart rate accelerate with nervousness and shame. "I wanted to speak with you," Mitchell said quietly, his accent carrying the same authority it had during the arrest but without the anger. "I owe you an apology," Marcus said immediately. "What I did was inexcusable. I disrespected you, your service, and everything you stand for. I'm genuinely sorry." Mitchell studied him for a moment before responding. "I appreciate that. I've been watching you work these past months. Mrs. Davies tells me you've been exemplary in your service." They talked for nearly an hour that evening, with Mitchell explaining the history and importance of the King's Guard traditions, while Marcus shared his journey from entitled influencer to someone who was learning to understand the value of service and respect. The conversation transformed Marcus's understanding of his punishment. What he had initially seen as an unfair consequence for a harmless prank he now recognized as an opportunity to learn lessons he had never been taught growing up in a culture that prioritized fame and attention over character and service. Word of Marcus's transformation began to spread through social media, but this time the coverage was different. Instead of mockery and outrage, people began sharing stories about redemption and personal growth. His genuine remorse and dedicated community service had begun to shift public opinion. Though he knew it would never fully undo the damage of that initial incident, Marcus's parents visited him again near the end of his community service period. They were amazed by the change in their son. The entitled, attention-seeking young man who had left California had been replaced by someone more mature, more thoughtful, and more aware of how his actions affected others. "You've grown up, son," his father Robert said during their final dinner together in London. "I'm proud of the man you're becoming, even though I wish it hadn't taken all this for you to get here." On his final day of community service, Marcus received an unexpected visitor. Colonel Davies, the commanding officer of the King's Guard Regiment, appeared as Marcus was completing his last hour of work. "Mr. Thompson," the colonel said formally, "I understand you complete your service today." "Yes, sir," Marcus replied, unconsciously standing at attention in a way that showed his newfound respect for military bearing. "I wanted to personally acknowledge that you have conducted yourself with dignity during your sentence. You have shown genuine remorse and have worked to make amends for your actions. That speaks well of your character." The colonel's words meant more to Marcus than any social media praise ever had. This was recognition from someone whose opinion was based on character and conduct, rather than popularity or entertainment value. Marcus returned to California a different person than the one who had left. His social media accounts, which had once been his obsession, remained largely dormant. Instead, he found work with a veterans assistance organization, using his experience to help young people understand the importance of respect and service. The viral fame he had sought so desperately had indeed changed his life, but not in any way he could have predicted. Instead of making him a celebrity, it had taught him the difference between notoriety and respect, between attention and admiration, between being famous and being worthy of fame. Years later, Marcus would occasionally be recognized by people who remembered the incident at Buckingham Palace. But instead of shame, these encounters now filled him with gratitude for the hard lessons that had ultimately made him a better person. The King's Guard had indeed left him speechless, but not through punishment, through the unexpected gift of teaching him how to become a man worthy of respect.